What to make of a brewing trade war? I have no idea, but if history does not repeat, it often rhymes, and many of you have asked me this question. So I thought I would bring up 3 episodes that, if you look into them more, might inform your thinking on this question. From the Great Sea Ban to the national products movement of the 20th century and then back to the Qianlong Emperor, it's a very quick triple feature. We'll start with this moment of high drama here as Ming forces fight with pirates in the 16th century, and zooming in for a closer look. The Chinese forces here are, of course, the heroes. Now, from the very moment it came to power in the 14th century, the Ming dynasty had a number of foreign relations issues. And one way to deal with people you don't like is to not deal with them at all, to try to shut them out and starve them or bring them to heel without access to your markets. And so they enacted the Haijin, the so-called sea ban in English, which prohibited any private foreign trade at all. And incidentally, the Qing dynasty did just the same for a brief period at the very beginning, too. This policy was variously enforced depending upon the place and time, but in its harshest forms, actually required coastal communities to uproot and move inland. So harsh was it, a kind of scorched earth policy, but against the sea. Conventionally, it's described as being an anti-Japanese and anti-pirate measure, but in fact, it was directed against loads of people, and many of those making up the crews on these ships were themselves ethnically Chinese. And don't forget, to get called a pirate, really all you have to do is something the state doesn't like. And this policy during the Ming remained on the books for 196 years. It was, of course, grossly harmful to many, especially those maritime communities engaged in trade. There are many lessons you all could take here, but one to consider is about the relative powers of politics and economics. Economics, and I'm putting that word in quotation marks, has been a nasty Moloch for the last few generations under the dispensation present in the United States, at least. This is no crack at economists. Among the people I've loved most in this life have been economists and those who enjoy econometric methodologies. What I mean instead is the uncritical worship of the supposedly fundamental laws of human behavior assumed by people who are so deluded as to be unaware of their own ideology. Put less crazily, there is a prevailing assumption of the power of economic incentives, which is all well and good only in moments when people are not politically activated and energized. When that happens, politics really is in command. Does it matter that you're hurting the livelihood of millions and wrecking the economy of a great swath of your country? Not really, if that's the way you decide you want to do things. And politics has this power even in systems much more representative than China's then or now. But an entirely separate issue, much on my mind even before present circumstances, was the question of economic nationalism. And the truth is, we have been here before 100 years ago, as this flyer tells us. It's from a patriotic exhibition of Chinese goods from January 1929. One path to national wealth, people thought in the early 20th century, was the stimulation of the domestic economy, that maybe in a world of often unfair competition, you should buy local and buy Chinese. This was the Guohuo Yundong, the so-called national products movement that you can look up on your own. The effort was to make consumers consider Chineseness as a potential ingredient in the goods that they were thinking about buying. That could be measured differently. Did Chinese labor go into it, or Chinese capital, or was it a Chinese company or a Chinese brand? And people could disagree on these metrics. And I see stirring, in an admittedly still minor key way, similar impulses in both China and the United States domestically. With the advantage of 100 years of hindsight, I can tell you that this did not work out quite as its proponents had hoped. The sloganeering was motivating and powerful, and everyone wanted to do it, but when consumers opened their wallets, that's not exactly how they behaved. It was no easier, in other words, to get people to buy Chinese in the 1920s or 1930s than it was for the United States to get people to buy American in the 1980s or 90s. To frame it in the terms we discussed in my first example, as a purely social, civil society kind of movement, people didn't quite care enough in this case. But let's jump back now to the end of the 18th century and the episode most of you are likely to be most familiar with. Lord Macartney's visit from the court of King George to the great Qing Empire and the Qianlong Emperor, pictured here through European eyes. This was from a book of one of the people that went on that mission. Qianlong famously rejected the British effort to create a co-equal relationship for trade between the two countries. You may even know the famous quote, "Our empire possesses all things in great abundance. So basically, we have no need of you or of trade." Is that sounding familiar? The pomposity probably is similar to what you might have been hearing from Victor Gao and others appearing in the media. But both then and now, I think you are interpreting this wrongly if you are interpreting it at face value. The Qianlong Emperor, who said he had no need of gewgaws and the ingenious devices that the British had brought along in the form of clocks and telescopes and more, was the same Qianlong Emperor who probably had one of the largest collections in the world of European clocks. He loved their gewgaws and fantastic clocks, in other words. It was the same Qianlong Emperor who knew very well that he was enriched, as were his subjects, by the not inconsiderable trade out of the south of the country with the men of the Western Ocean, the British and others. So why did he say what he did? As always in critical thinking, you have to consider his audiences. The direct first audience, of course, were the particular foreigners, Lord Macartney and King George. But there were other audiences, too. Of course, all the other countries that might want different trade relationships and concessions if this one were granted. And maybe even more important, as always, the domestic audience in China, the Qing Empire itself. You strike a pose of strength, of power for negotiation, but also at home for your most important constituents. And the Qianlong Emperor was right, by the way, in his response, at least in my view, and not short-sighted, though that's the subject for a different video. But when you hear pronouncements from Beijing or its spokespeople or all of these videos on TikTok saying how, China is going to win the trade war and America is destroyed, you should think of it in this way. I understand perfectly what these people have to do as an exercise in public relations, but you'll notice when they talk about China and its reactions, they are almost always talking at the highest level from a kind of regime point of view, and no matter what happens, the elite will be fine. But the part that worries me, or the part that hurts my heart the most, or the part that I wish was addressed more, was how China, more broadly considered, might feel. Because no matter what, this is going to hurt. These last years Things have not been easy, and I'm switching away from emperors and leaders and asking you to consider the faces of just some normal bros here, measuring gears to make sure your product works well. This is a factory up in the Northeast just earlier this year. People are getting by, and they'll continue to, but it's a struggle to see to themselves and their families. And it's not just the workers. It will be people who are a little higher up too, even people that own these export-oriented factories. And I'd like to ask you for some consideration, for some compassion for these human beings too, just as you might feel for those workers in your own country. And finally, guys, remember, I'm not speaking with authority here. I am freestyling and free associating across several centuries with analogies and precedents you can pursue on your own. And I bring this just for your consideration because many of you did ask. The past is unpredictable enough. I won't even try with the future.